Imagine not a map with fronts, not generals leaning over a table, but a single thin notebook. On the cover, a smeared stain of mud, inside, uneven handwriting, September 1914. Next to it lies another notebook, the poems of a young poet who still believes war is glory and honor. By the end of the war, these voices will sound very, very different. Introduction. A war told by those who saw it up close. World War I often feels distant. Black and white newsreels, old maps, names of generals that mean little to us. But its real truth lives somewhere else, in the poems and diaries of people who lived in trenches, field hospitals, and wards for shell-shocked soldiers. In this video, we won't talk about the maneuvers of armies and diplomacy. We'll follow a path from glory to disillusionment, from the first enthusiastic poems to the bitter lines of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and ordinary soldiers whose diaries sometimes survived by pure chance. This is a story of how war first promised glory and then turned into a nightmare, and how poetry and personal writing became witnesses of that transformation. Chapter 1. August 1914, a time of illusions and glory. Summer 1914. Europe is at the height of its confidence. Science, progress, aviation, railways, electric light. People feel they are living in the most rational, civilized century. And suddenly, the assassination in Sarajevo, a chain of ultimatums, mobilization, a war that many greet with enthusiasm. Newspapers print patriotic poems. Young poets write about glory, honor, the sweetness of dying for one's country. There are huge lines of volunteers at recruitment offices. In the diary of a typical British student of that time, you might read something like, "At last our hour has come. I cannot stay behind when my country calls. We'll be back by Christmas with medals on our chests." Officers pose proudly in their new uniforms. The air is almost festive. Brass bands, speeches, marching columns, flowers in the hands of those saying goodbye. The poems of that time are full of pathos and romanticism, war as an adventure, as a test of courage, as a way to purify the nation. No one yet knows that in just a few months the words glory and romance will sound like a cruel joke. Chapter 2. The Trenches, a reality no one writes about at first autumn and winter 1914-1915. The quick war doesn't happen. The front stalls. Trench warfare begins. Here, nothing looks like the patriotic posters. Mud that swallows boots. Rats that run across sleeping men. Water that stands in the trenches for months. Corpses that can't be buried immediately and lie somewhere very close, behind the parapet. In letters home, soldiers often write, "I'm doing fine, don't worry, we're holding on." Censorship doesn't let through honest descriptions of horror, and the soldiers themselves don't always want to tell their families the truth. Sometimes to protect them, sometimes because there simply are no words. But personal diaries are much more honest. Their tone is completely different. It's been raining for the 7th day. The trenches turned into a swamp. Last night, Jack just didn't come back from patrol. No one asks where he is, as if he never existed. We've run out of dry socks. I never thought a human life could depend on socks. This is a world where slogans don't matter. Only very simple things do. Dry feet, hot tea, a chance to sleep at least a couple of hours without shell bursts. It's in this world that a new kind of poetry is slowly born. The poetry of disillusionment. Chapter 3. Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. When poetry climbed down into the trenches before the war, war poetry often looked at battles from above, from the point of view of generals, heroes, and noble images. Now it climbs down into the filth of the trenches. Wilfred Owen is a young British poet. Before the war, he writes about nature, faith, the beauty of the world. In 1915, he goes to France as an officer. Soon he realizes that the reality of the front doesn't fit into any of the old patterns. Siegfried Sassoon is another poet and officer. At the beginning of the war, he is also full of patriotism, volunteers for the front, fights bravely, wins decorations. But the longer he stays in the trenches, the more venom and sarcasm appear in his poems. Their paths cross in a hospital for soldiers with mental wounds, where they treat what was then called shell shock. But the key thing is this: both start writing about war differently, without romanticism, without sugarcoating, without false heroism. Owen speaks about war in a language that has more room for pain than for glory. Sassoon speaks in a language of anger and bitter irony. Chapter 4. Sweet and Fitting. How Poems Expose Old Myths. In those years, British schools still quote the Latin phrase, Dulciet decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. This is a slogan that has decorated textbooks, monuments, and patriotic speeches for centuries. Owen takes this phrase and literally turns it against the very idea of a sweet death. In one of his poems, we won't quote it in full here so we don't lose the flow of the narration, he describes a gas attack. Soldiers trudging through mud up to their knees, exhausted, bent over, like old men. A sudden shout, gas! Panic, frantic attempts to put on masks in time, and one man who doesn't make it. Then comes the scene of how his comrades watch him die in agony, choking on foam. Only after this brutal description does Owen turn to those back home who keep telling boys about the sweet and fitting death. He tells them, if you had seen this even once, you would never again repeat those words to teenage boys. The phrase that once sounded like a heroic motto becomes in Owen's poem an old lie. This is a turning point. Poetry stops supporting the myth and starts destroying it. Chapter 5. Sassoon. Sarcasm aimed at generals and the home front. If Owen's voice is often one of compassion, then Siegfried Sassoon speaks with the voice of accusation. He sees high command sending soldiers into pointless attacks. In his poems we meet generals who politely smile at their men in the morning and send them to die in the evening, heroic speeches given in the safety of the home front by people who have never been under fire. Patriotic ladies handing out white gloves and pamphlets while soldiers at the front lose arms and legs. In one of his poems he describes a meeting with a general who cheerfully talks about an upcoming offensive. The soldiers politely answer, "Yes, sir." A few lines later, we learn that almost all of them will die in the very first assault. Sassoon's poems cut to the bone. They don't let the reader hide behind the comfortable distance of long-gone times. He is essentially saying, these men didn't die because of some abstract war. They died because of very specific decisions, foolish, blind, sometimes cynical. His protest goes so far that he writes a public statement against the continuation of the war, for which he is deemed mentally unstable and sent to a special hospital. Here, poetry literally becomes a form of resistance. Chapter 6. The Diaries of Ordinary Soldiers. Simple words about the unbearable poets like Owen and Sassoon are the tip of the iceberg. But under the surface lie thousands upon thousands of anonymous voices recorded in diaries. Here is a private who writes a few short lines every day. His language is simpler, and that makes his words even stronger. Today, we got a new batch of boots. The old ones have long rotted. Some were walking with their feet wrapped in rags. The guy in the bunk next to me snored so loudly I wanted to strangle him. Now he's lying down there in a shell hole. The silence is worse than his snoring. I wrote home that I'll be back soon, but after yesterday's attack I feel like that's a lie, and yet I'm still going to tell them I'm fine. You rarely see big words like honor, glory, duty in these lines. Instead you see exhaustion, fear, clumsy jokes, and sometimes the blackest humor. Many diaries end abruptly. The last entry can be completely ordinary. Today the cook gave us an extra portion of stew. I'd call that a good day. And we, knowing the dates of the battles, understand that in a day or two the author will be dead. That knowledge is one of the most painful things about reading such texts. Chapter 7. Women's Voices. Nurses and fiancés who wait war is not only trenches, but also hospitals. Nurses keep diaries that are often even harsher than the soldiers' notes. They see the consequences of attacks, wounds, amputations, broken teenagers who turn into old men overnight. In a nurse's diary, you might find lines like these. Today they brought in another trainload of wounded. The youngest is 17. He keeps repeating his mother's name. I can't tell him she won't make it in time. Or, sometimes it feels like the whole world has shrunk to the smell of iodine, blood, and bleach. I'm afraid I'll never again be able to look at the color red calmly. There are other women's voices too, those of fiancées, wives, sisters. At first their letters are full of support and pride. We are all so proud of you. You're our hero. Come back with victory. Later, they are full of exhaustion and despair. I can hardly remember what you look like. The photo on the dresser doesn't seem to be you anymore. I catch myself sometimes not dreaming of victory, but simply of you coming home, in any shape. These letters and diaries show that disillusionment with the war is not only a front-line experience. The home front also slowly loses faith in the beautiful slogans. Chapter 8. The Shadow of Trauma. When the war doesn't end inside, even those who survived physically often carried the war inside themselves for the rest of their lives. There's no modern term PTSD yet, but there is shell shock, war neurosis. Soldiers stutter, flinch at any loud sound, cannot sleep without nightmares, cannot stand certain objects, smells, or sounds. In post-war diaries you sometimes read, "Today kids were playing in the park and setting off firecrackers. I dropped to the ground, covering my head with my hands, before I realized it wasn't shell fire." Or, "I can't explain to my wife why I hate winter. For her it's snow and holidays. For me, it's trenches filled with water turning into icy slush and people dying from cold, not bullets." Owen's and Sassoon's poetry is full of these post-war shadows too. Even when a poem is about a battle, behind it lurks the question, how do you live with this afterwards? Many, like Owen, won't live to see the end of the war at all, dying literally days before the armistice. Others will live long lives, but the war will stay with them, in dreams, flashes of memory, lines of verse. Chapter 9. November 11th, 1918. A victory that doesn't feel like victory. November 11th, 1918. At 11 a.m. the armistice takes effect. Newsreels show people dancing in the streets, hugging, celebrating. But if you look into the diaries of those who stand on the front line at that moment, the tone is very different. One writes, "We just sat and waited for 11 o'clock. When the guns fell silent, the silence rang in our ears. No one shouted. Hurrah! We just stared at each other and at the empty horizon where yesterday the explosions flashed." Another writes, "I ought to be happy, but all I feel is exhaustion. Too many of those I'd like to hug today will never see this day." For many, the end of the war is not catharsis, but emptiness. They return home to a world that doesn't understand what they went through. There are celebrations in the streets. Inside, a silence heavier than artillery. Chapter 10. How poems and diaries changed our view of war before World War I. European culture had spent centuries glorifying heroic death, glorious battles, and knights on the field of honor. After Owen, Sassoon, and hundreds of diary voices, this becomes much harder. Their texts do several things. They destroy the myth of clean, noble war. War appears as a machine that grinds people down, regardless of their courage, faith, patriotism. They give faces and names back to the dead. Instead of faceless casualties, we see stories of real people, with their fears, hopes, funny habits, and letters to their mothers. They change the language. Pathos gives way to irony, bitterness, and sometimes black humor. Words like glory and honor start to sound suspicious if they're not backed by an honest description of reality. They become a warning for the future. Many of these authors, directly or indirectly, send us a message. If you ever again talk about war as a beautiful adventure, read this once more. After these poems and diaries, a whole new tradition of anti-war literature and cinema emerges. When we watch war films that don't glorify soldiers, but show them as fragile, living people, behind that stands in large part those same poets and diaries of World War I. Conclusion: From Glory to Truth. The title of our video, From Glory to Disillusionment, World War I in Poems and Diaries, describes a path from glory to disillusionment, but in reality, it's a path from illusions to truth. At the beginning of the war, poets and ordinary people believe in a bright, short, heroic campaign. In the trenches, that belief collides with mud, cold, gas, and the deaths of friends. In poems and diaries, we first see doubts, then irritation, then anger, and finally deep disillusionment. And yet, there is not only darkness in these texts, there is friendship, the willingness to share the last ration, rare moments of silence when one can look at the stars and remember that the world has not always been a trench. The most important thing is that these writings preserve the human voice, where everything was designed to turn people into nameless units, into statistics. When we read Owen or Sassoon, when we open an old diary written by a simple private, we are literally giving these people their right to tell their story back. And maybe this is the main reason to turn to the poetry and diaries of World War I today, not to admire someone else's tragedy, but to better understand the price people pay for beautiful slogans about glory and honor. If it mattered to you to hear these voices, don't let them once again dissolve into dry numbers in a school textbook.